2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 6 to 7. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from whom you learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. Mark chapter 9. He took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Deuteronomy chapter 6. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up.
Thanks, everyone. This has been a truly wonderful and special service thus far, and obviously this kind of thing doesn't. That didn't come out quite right. I trust it's still going to continue to be a very, very special and wonderful service. I'm not saying that this is going to be some kind of anticlimax. It's been a great service so far, and obviously something like this doesn't happen without the help of a whole lot of volunteers and people behind the scenes. So there are just so many people to thank for this morning. But I wanted to give a couple of special shout-outs to people who have gone particularly above and beyond. Pete and Sarah, these guys are really responsible for starting the youth band rehearsals, and they are also primarily responsible for teaching the kids, and by extension us, some of these new wonderful songs as well. So these guys have been putting in hard yards. Last term on a Tuesday evening, they had a couple of really good sessions with the kids, just spending time with them and encouraging them and helping them just get better at that God-given talents of singing and playing instruments. So thank you so much, guys, for that, and that's going to continue this term as well. So that's a big deal, so thank you. And also I wanted to say a very big thank you to Aaron and Ash. So this was Aaron's original idea, so credit where it's due. It's been a fantastic idea. Again, like with the short time frames and coming back from school holidays, I was like a little bit kind of skeptical as to whether it could happen, but she's made it happen. So thank you so much to her and Ash. These guys have put in hours behind the scenes during the week, coming here into the building, preparing it, getting the kids ready, again, going above and beyond. So thank you guys for having the creative genius and the hard work to put this together. It's been great. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So, numbers could have been called grumblers. Numbers could have been called grumblers. That is, the Old Testament book of Numbers can also be referred to as grumblers, given the amount of complaining that so many of its characters partake in. This little line, Numbers could be called grumblers, has been stuck in my head now for at least 40 years, 4 decades plus. This has been rattling around my head. It's probably the oldest bit of commentary on the Bible that I have. It was concise, it was kind of funny, it was memorable to a roughly 10-year-old boy. It just stuck in my head. And I learnt that line from my very first, well, probably at least the very first Sunday school teacher that I can remember. We'll call him Mr. L. Mr. L was the father of one of my mates growing up and a member of the church that I grew up in. And looking back on him now, as you do when you get a bit older, it struck me that he probably wasn't your kind of typical Sunday school teacher. He was a pretty quiet guy. I think I'm almost 100% certain that he was a Vietnam vet, and he was also a hospital orderly. He was like a salt of the earth kind of classic 80s guy that could have come straight out of a Bruce Springsteen 80s song. He was just like that. I remember that he had this very kind of bare bones gym that he set up in his kind of concrete garage. He was probably the guy least likely to become the next Wiggle. He wasn't like a guy you kind of associate as being great with kids. But he was my Sunday school teacher for a bit. And he was part of my first church family for a long time. And he taught me something about a 2,000-plus-year-old book that has stuck with me ever since, and that is no small thing. And what's even more remarkable is that he wasn't like a Bible scholar. He wasn't like any kind of wannabe rocket scientist. He was just a regular dude. But again, looking back, it was the fact that he was a regular dude that made what he did all the more memorable. I can't remember much else about what Mr. L taught me in Sunday school, but what I do remember is the impression that he made. I couldn't have articulated it back then, but the sum of it was that this guy, this quiet Vietnam vet, and that had some mystique and credibility in Bernie in the 80s, at least for 10-year-old boys, he thought it was a worthwhile thing to volunteer in church. He thought that was a worthwhile use of his time and his energy. And on some really important level, he cared about me and he cared about my peers. And that made an impression, I think, even all the way back then. Thinking about it, church is such a unique environment for kids. A good church will provide them, I think, with something that they won't get anywhere else. My experience of church has been very blessed. And this is a good time to acknowledge that not every kid had my safe and supportive experience of a church growing up. Tragically, the very place and people who should be most exemplifying the self-sacrificial love of Jesus have too often been betrayed by people who should have kept that charge. They've been preyed upon by those who should have been caring for them instead. And that's a particularly grievous sin. So what I'm talking about this morning is really an ideal. It's something to strive for. But please don't think that because I'm talking about an ideal that I'm somehow naively idealistic about church. I had a great family environment to grow up in. My schooling experience was fairly pleasant, and I don't think I ever lacked a healthy and supportive band of friends. At least that's how I remember it, and it works for me. So I'm fortunate across all those different domains. But at the same time, church brought something else that complemented, if you like, all those other good things in my life. Again, it was truly unique. How? Well, in many ways, including the opportunity to practice using my gifts to serve other people. And as we've already had demonstrated this morning, kids helping serve us with their gifts, the way that they're going to keep on serving us after the service. So there's so many different aspects in terms of how it's unique. But this morning, I really want to concentrate on three unique qualities in particular. And they are a communal spirituality, a place where intergenerational relationships can be forged, and where love, acceptance, and forgiveness can be practiced. So the first one, church models whole of life communal spirituality. Again, I think about it, what else do we have in our lives that involve you and other people, so it's communal, and not just your immediate family, but people that go beyond your immediate family, regularly meeting together around the explicitly spiritual and faith-based. Where else does that happen? It's almost as if, a bit like this, it's almost as if church is an opportunity, particularly for kids, they can see other people that are like them, but not exactly like them, a little bit further along the road, and they can see what faith looks like modelled in that person's life, at stage by stage by stage by stage. The older you get, you've almost always got a few people who are further along the road than you are, and you can see what following Jesus looks like at that age and stage of life. And where do you find something that is so holistic, such a cliche these days, it's so early, to pay that virtue of holistic lip service. But in church, that is actually lived out. So already, some of the kids at MCC have experienced, for example, the blessings of being the recipients of a meal train. They've had people, adults who aren't related to them, go to the trouble of making them meals, for example. Many of the kids will remember things like babies being born, people getting married, people breaking up, people passing away, seeing you in your pyjamas over breakfast at church camps, being on your table at church quiz nights. They're going to hear sermons and communions and children's stories that cover things like grief and loss, work, finances, busyness, conflict, and practical wisdom. Where else will they get this? In a world that can be so easily compartmentalised, hyper-individualised and often lonely, they get to see and experience firsthand what a holistic spirituality may look like amongst a community of like-minded people. While church should aim to keep kids, I think, particularly kids, entertained on some level, this isn't a place or an environment that is primarily about entertainment. Because there are so many better ways and options for kids to be purely entertained. And the same thing for socialising. Like it's great and necessary that good social bonds are forged here between kids. But while that's necessary, it's just not enough. Church can provide that communal, again, holistic spiritual focus, and that's special, that's unique. And when it comes to teaching and modelling this whole of life spirituality, this following Jesus, I don't think there's really that much risk of us these days shoveling it down kids' throats, if you like. If anything, I think like the risk is we can be almost too reserved. We can assume sometimes that children will pick it up all via osmosis, and they will pick up a lot via osmosis, but I think we can still take it for granted that they're getting it. And I'm not so much convinced of this anymore after talking to young adults who were former Christians who have since left the faith. And usually they say that it is at least in part, they've left the faith at least in part, to struggling with issues that are remarkably common and have well thought out responses, all because of cliches and stereotypes that they'd picked up in the surrounding culture about Christianity that just aren't true. Again, these kind of simplistic often and incorrect cliches could have and should have been dismantled by churches. But we can so easily assume that those in our midst, that our kids are immune to this because they've picked up the truth along the way. You know, it's just so easy to forget that they're being exposed to constantly and bombarded by other worldviews all the time. And all these voices, all these competing voices that are vying for their attention so effectively, it's going to make it hard to discern, if you like, what we're trying to convey Sunday to Sunday, day to day, week to week. And that's why I think that these verses from Deuteronomy that Harry read out before are just so helpful. These commandments that I give you today are to be in your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. So talk about what we believe. Talk about who we follow when we're at home, when we're communing with the kids, at the start of the day, at the end of the day. And talk about it in a matter-of-fact, kind of everyday, non-pious way. So that's the first, I think, unique element about church. Communal, holistic, spiritual community. But it's also unique for kids in the sense that it's a truly intergenerational experience. So more so, I'd say, than our natural families and more so than most social clubs that you can belong to, we have such a wide range of ages and stages and backgrounds here. And that is just great. And you can see it, if you're looking for it, most Sunday morning. So it's the kid who's working the front door alongside an adult that they're not related to. And you can just see them getting along and connecting. It's the volunteer youth group leader who's establishing a bond with one of the participants that will hopefully serve that participant well into young adulthood. There's been heaps of research done supporting the idea that it's not so much the peer relationships that keep kids in church as they age and become adults, but it's a network of supportive intergenerational relationships. It's a big web. It's a big web. And that makes sense to me, because I think as kids get older, particularly and hit teens and late teens, they're working out just how plausible Christianity is for the long term. They're moving from a faith that's almost vicarious or potentially inherited from their family, and they're seeking to make it their own, and they're starting to ask understandable, hard questions. And an intergenerational church family gives them more examples of people from different ages and stages, again, not just their immediate family, living out that faith. So as a parent, I could try making the same point. I could try explaining the same truth. I could ask the same pertinent questions again, time and time, to my sons. and it could just seemingly like bounce off. But if someone like Mark Johns suggests it, then suddenly lights go on and it's a little epiphany. Same thing, they've just heard it from someone else. And this is something else that I think we as adults, we can understandably underestimate. How kids here view us, how much they pick up on. Not wanting to scare people, but you may be surprised by the influence we can have on kids and their faith, even in the seemingly mundane ways. So the relationships that we have with kids here at MCC, the interest that we show in them, the regular, every week pleasantries of just saying hello and acknowledging their presence, all this stuff adds up over time. It makes an impression. Have you ever thought about it like this? Where else do kids go where so many adults who, again, not related to them and thus not obliged, or not employed and thus paid, where else do they go where these adults are going to hang out even just a little with them, or maybe even serve them, do something for them? That's just so unique in our world. No obligation, no financial recompense. And in time and over time, it's got to make an impression. I can still remember, again, going back to my home church that I grew up in, I can just remember being encouraged and included by the adults there. Again, this is the Northwest Coast in the 80s, and there was a big flatbed truck that was owned by a farmer who was part of the congregation, and every December, all the guys would jump on the back of this flatbed truck in hay bales and just drove around Burnie singing carols to people. All around Burnie singing carols to people, announcing that it was Christmas, whether you wanted to hear it or not. You still got some free carols. So there was something like that. So I was included, like side by side with all these adult males, and it was cool. I even remember like doing a solo vocal number up the front of our church, and there was no risk that anyone was going to mistake me for the next Joel Hobson or maybe Keith Green, but it was still really encouraging, right? It was still, like, primarily for me. It was welcoming, it was inclusive. And I felt in this simplistic but still sincere, like, primary school way that I knew these people, and these people knew me, and that meant I was more likely to actually heed, to pay attention to what they were trying to teach and model to me. So those verses we heard from 2 Timothy are just so true. Continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from who you learned it, because you know those from who you learned it. There is some relational credibility there. And how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. The people who are trying to teach you as a child what's contained in those Holy Scriptures in the Bible, they can have so much more impact if you as the recipient, if you know and trust those who are trying to teach that to you. That's what I believe. So kids in church, they can't be held at a kind of safe arm's length in that regard. It's not even the same as school. We're not just trying to disseminate or pass on information here. We're trying to model a way of life, a faith. Fundamentally, we're trying to demonstrate what it means to be in a relationship with Christ, a relationship we want them to have firsthand. In that case, they have to see that it's real for us too. And this is no small thing. And when it doesn't work out, it can be challenging to a kid's idea of Christianity. When I was really young, I was in some Sunday school end-of-year performance, and we were seated on some like bleacher-style tiered bench seats. I was quite high up on the edge of the row, and back then there were no guardrails on the sides, right? And maybe it was late, maybe it was particularly hot, but I started dozing off and just like listing to the side. And I was about to tumble off this precipice, and I swear I still remember the head Sunday school teacher, like a volunteer, gently picking me up as I was starting to totter over, and he just delivered me to safety. It's a very, very comforting memory. He was a family man, had a wife and a couple of kids. He was really involved in church, and he was a respected and successful businessman in the community at the time. And I respected him, again, in my primary school way. So when it came to light that he'd been cheating on his wife when on overseas mission trips, it hit pretty hard in a late primary, early high school way. This guy had taught me, he'd guided me, he'd stopped me from fall-induced bone injuries. I'd really looked up to him, and suddenly he's out of my life, boom, And he's done something that even at that young age I felt was really wrong. So again, in that kind of early high school way, you're asking, what does it say about the faith that he professed? What does it say about growing up and being a man? And here's the point of this anecdote. I'm fairly certain this guy that he never woke up at 3 a.m. on the verge of deciding to cheat on his wife or not, thinking, but if I do this, what will it mean for young Matt Bain and his peers? How will it potentially rock their young and delicate faith in God? I don't think that was going through his head. I expect that never factored into his decision. And not because he was callous, but because he didn't know how much of a positive impact he was having on me as a mere volunteer Sunday school teacher and regular all-round guy at church. Do you see what I mean? We're having an influence on our kids, on the kids in our midst, conscious or not, intentional or not. We're having some kind of influence. And lastly, church is a unique environment for kids because they can experience love, acceptance, and forgiveness. And they can experience this in a way, I think, that's different, even from a healthy family, in that the emotional intensity of a family won't be there. I went to Christian schools and they were overall great, but it was still easy to confuse morality and academic performance with Christianity. Just like you can confuse Christianity with trying to please your parents. Church can be different on both fronts. Again, this is a place where the pressure to perform, if you like, can be dialed down. So here's an example. The family church down the road here, they have a great and long-standing youth group. It's located, their church, in the middle of Huntingfield. So they get a lot of kids from the local area who aren't part of a church attending the youth group. And they intentionally try to have a large number of leaders because they want them on hand just to hang out with the kids who turn up but who don't feel like participating in a discussion or don't want to participate in a game. They want leaders to be available, just to be able to come alongside those kids and be there for an open conversation and some company. And that is such a gift, because in almost any other context, you'd probably get something like, okay, kid, it's your choice, you get with the program, or you just don't turn up. It's your choice. But they're offering those kids some form of, I think, like a really inclusive grace. And that's a great example of the last verse that we heard read before, courtesy of Harry. Jesus taking a little child whom he placed among them and saying to his disciples, whoever welcomes, which can be translated to be concerned about, to care for, to show kindness to, one of these little children in my name, that is, as Jesus would, or to do it for Jesus' sake, welcomes me, welcomes God. Kids in Jesus' world had very little social standing compared to today. The high infant mortality rates meant that adults probably would have some psychological reasons not to get too or readily attached to their children. And they had to go to work as soon as they could. But of course, the kids couldn't provide the same quality of work as adults, so they weren't given the same value. Safe to say, the kids wouldn't have gotten their own ABC channels back then. It was a very different world. But Jesus tells his followers to welcome them, to show them kindness, concern, just like he did. And it's not because he got anything out of it. It's not because there was some kind of reciprocal relationship between equals. Instead, it shows that God cares for the least and the most little amongst us. And church should be an environment where kids can still experience that no strings, you don't have to perform here, love and acceptance. Where they can screw up, make mistakes, and readily experience grace and forgiveness as opposed to ostracism, disappointment, and resentment. And just as importantly, church also provides an opportunity to see adults model that towards other adults. So going back to my Sunday school headmaster who cheated on his wife, I can't remember any trace of him being vilified, demonised, etc. I'm sure people were angry, and I'm sure adults did the appropriate thing and kept a lot of it behind closed doors, and rightly so. But thinking back, it was a good early lesson and that the world is not as simple as good guys versus bad guys. Christianity and church, even back then, it showed me that we are all flawed, we're all broken somehow, and that's a great leveler. It showed me that we should be dispensing grace and forgiveness, given that we all need to be recipients of that same grace and forgiveness. And we can teach and model this to kids through both word and deed. Church should be great for that. So this is an encouragement, or maybe a reminder. Please, please, please don't underestimate the influence, the impact, and the importance you have and you hold in the lives of these kids who turn up on Sundays. And you may never have talked to some of them, but they see you. They see you. They notice you. Their rapidly growing brains are making connections between you and what Christianity means. And don't underestimate the importance of church for kids. Again, I truly believe this is a unique and special environment that we have. And I also believe, and I know firsthand, it is often difficult and challenging, even just to get them here on a Sunday. But over the long term, man, it's like Louie still tells me she remembers class. So Louie, my wife, who has been here a lot longer than I have, she grew up, she had classes as youth group leader. She remembers Dave D running the Simply Awesome nights, and so on and so forth. Louie volunteered as a youth group leader. Louie got involved in helping out kids who are younger than her. This stuff really has a long-lasting impact over time. They won't get this collective witness to Jesus, an example of what it means to love and follow him across the whole of life anywhere else. And my hope and prayer is that in a decade or two, there were people standing up here talking about the positive impact that we had on them. That's the prayer. So if you'd like to join me in praying for that now, that'd be great. Father, I want to thank you for the great blessing, the great encouragement, the joy that the kids in our midst bring. I pray that we will be just conscious of the fact that you have placed us here. You've given us this opportunity to help guide them, to encourage them, to just demonstrate to them your love, your grace, and your forgiveness. And you've also given us the charge to both model and to teach them your ways and what it means to be in a relationship with you. So I pray you'll give us the loving motivation to do that, and not because we want to make little kind of carved out carbon copies of ourselves, and not because we want to big note ourselves or feed our egos, or not because we feel obliged to, but help what we do and the service that we show to them be driven by love. And I pray that we will be mindful, just appropriately mindful of the fact that they are taking notice, they are watching in their way, they're learning from us, whether we're conscious of that or not. And help that inform the way that we treat each other too, I pray. And I thank you again that you haven't left us alone. We've got the assistance of your Spirit, we've got the guidance of your word, and we have the encouragement and the camaraderie of doing this with brothers and sisters. Amen.